Welcome back to our second week in the Two of Us series. Guys, last week we looked at Paul and Silas and how their friendship allowed them to make the most of a pretty rotten situation they found themselves in. And that is just one of many benefits of accountability partnerships. Now, Paul and Silas, they had this late night worship concert going on in jail because they were suffering together. It was easier that way. The concert and the earthquake that happened led to a lot of people being saved that very night. And if they had been there alone, man, it might not have been quite the same, right? They might not have been so bold, but going through those tough times together makes it easier to handle. During our small groups, we talked about some of the goals that we have for our accountability partnerships when we get them up and running. They were to be two things that we want to do better because we have accountability partners, and then one thing that we want to kind of glean out or get rid of in our lives because of our friend holding us accountable. Tonight, though, we're going to look at another pair from Scripture that were able to do more together than they ever possibly could have done alone. So tonight's pair, we're going to go back into the Old Testament, and the book is actually called Ruth. But before we get to Ruth, we've got to start with Naomi. So let's start reading Ruth 1:1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, and from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. So that woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now, Naomi was the wife of Elimelech, and they had traveled into a foreign land to find food during a famine. She left with her husband and their 2 sons, and then sometime after they arrived, Elimelech, her husband, died. And after that tragedy struck, the sons were able to find wives and live normal lives for about 10 years before they died as well. Now, Naomi was left in a foreign land with only her daughter-in-laws. In this culture, in this time in history, women didn't have a lot of authority or the ability to make wages for themselves, right? It was a pretty scary spot for them. All 3 of these ladies were in a bad place. And as you can keep reading, things got better in Judah and the crops had started growing again. So Naomi decided to head back home where at least she had extended family. At first, her daughter-in-laws start the journey with her, but then Naomi tells them to go back to their families and try to find another start with a new husband. She was too old, Naomi was, but they were still young and they could still have the family that they both had wanted and dreamed of. But we read her kind words in Ruth 1:8 and 9, where it says, "But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept." This was a very emotional parting of ways for these ladies. And one of the daughters took her up on her words and went back to her family. But one of them had something else to say. And her words here are one of my favorite parts of the book of Ruth. So starting in Ruth 1:16, we read, "But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you.'" The connection, guys, between Ruth and Naomi wasn't just an in-law kind of relationship, right? Ruth was loyal to Naomi, turning her back on her own family to honor her connection and her commitment to Naomi. And her words are powerful in what we just read, and they convey the depth of her attachment to her mother-in-law. We aren't going to read the entire book tonight. We just don't have time. But as Ruth and Naomi make it back to Bethlehem, they have to eat. So Ruth starts collecting the grain that's left aside as the fields are harvested of one of Naomi's relatives. It was a common practice, actually, and some grain was intentionally left behind on purpose to help those widows who didn't have sons to take care of them. It was kind of part of the cultural norm. And as Ruth faithfully took care of Naomi and worked in the fields so they would be able to eat, the landowner took notice. He was a relative of Naomi. It's called Boaz. And you guys can read how it all goes down in the book of Ruth. But short story here, Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. They have a child named Obed, who had a child named Jesse, who had a really famous child named David. Yes, that David. Ruth went from a foreign daughter-in-law to the great-grandmother of King David himself. It's amazing how God worked all that out, and Ruth is even mentioned in the by name in the family tree of Jesus that we find in Matthew 1:5. It says, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David, the king. And that lineage goes on to give us Christ. We can learn several things from Ruth's life, first of which is how important loyalty is. If Ruth had not been loyal to Naomi and gone back with her family, man, history would have lost those people in the 10th verse of the book of Ruth, and we would have no idea how the family tree of David and even Jesus would have looked. But God had a plan in it, and Ruth was the perfect person for the job. She loved Naomi, and she didn't want to leave her alone, so she turned her back on her own people and her own future to travel back with her mother-in-law. But when it comes to sharing life with other people, loyalty is so important. You can't expect to share life with someone and then run when it gets hard, right? Nobody responds well to those kind of fair weather friends, and those kind of relationships are not going to hold up to real accountability that we're hoping to find. So the kind of loyalty that we need in our accountability partnerships comes with sacrifice. We have to think of the other person more than ourselves, and then we have to put their needs up as a priority in our lives, even when it's hard. Another thing that we can learn from Naomi and Ruth's story is that God is usually working in the ordinary events of life, right? Naomi had a tragic few years in the loss of her husband and then both of her sons, but there were no supernatural events, kind of like in Job's life. Then she returned home, and when Ruth went through a very normal situation to provide for her and Naomi. But even in those daily trips to the fields, Boaz was noticing Ruth, and God was softening his heart towards her over time. By being faithful in the small stuff, God was preparing Ruth for the big stuff, like her new life with Boaz and what it would mean to be a direct relative of King David. Some people might think that your accountability partners are there only for the big stuff, right? Like when you're in crisis mode, but that's so not the case. They are there for the chaos, but they're also there. Most of your time together is going to circle around the day-to-day stuff. As you build confidence in each other around those small things, the big things are going to be smoother when they happen. And your trust of each other is going to deepen over time together. It won't be like a magical overnight connection. Even if your accountability partner is one of your best friends right now, you've still got to build into that accountability. It's a totally different level of connection and transparency in your life. And that's why being loyal to each other is really important. So tonight in your small groups, we're going to take a look at a model of accountability meeting, right? And you don't have to follow this flow exactly. Find out what works for you guys, but you kind of need to have some agenda when you guys meet, so it doesn't just turn into a hangout time over coffee or pizza or whatever you end up doing. There's part of that in the plan, that hangout, but there are also other pieces that are important to both of you guys growing in maturity. So to start time off, begin going over whatever it is that you're reading together. If you're doing a Bible reading plan, then cover your favorite verse or favorite passage from the week. If you guys are reading a book together, then talk about your favorite concept or quote from the book that you read together. The first part is superficial on purpose, right? We don't just put 300 pounds on the bar and expect to lift it without warming up first, so we don't do the same in these conversations. Then we get a little more personal. You share your high point and your low point for the week. Make sure that you listen to the other person's answers as well, and you're empathetic to their lives, just as you hope they will be for you. Don't just kind of write it off as something you've done and ignore what they say. Take some time here to share life before moving on to the next part. And that third section to work on is that your goals. You should have shared these with each other early on. And of course, they can change as you go as well. But asking each other how you're doing on meeting the improvement goals in your life, and then also how you're doing on ridding your life of those things that are holding you back. This section is really personal, and it has got to be treated with trust and with confidentiality. We talked about that last week. I know my very first time meeting with my FCA accountability partner at Clemson, it was great up until this third part. When Michael Caldwell asked me how my purity was going, and I had to answer him with the honest details of where I had slipped up that week, guys, it wasn't fun anymore. But with his support, with his prayers, with his kindness, with his loyalty to me, I was able to get rid of those bad habits and make purity a priority in college, which is a small miracle in itself for those of you that are about to go to college. You'll understand when that time comes. After you have had a chance to share those 3 sections and listen to your partner's responses, before closing out, you need to take some time and pray for each other by name with the details that you just mentioned. There's not a special order or process, guys. These are just the 4 main areas that you need to hit weekly to help each other grow and not slip off the path. As you guys go into small groups, we're going to have you guys do kind of a test run, sort of, right, using these 4 points. You're going to see how the first 3 build on each other and the level of trust required to be honest, and why the loyalty that we saw in Ruth's life today is also so important to our accountability partnerships. We must be in this together for the long run and be willing to be honest with each other. Until we are ready to pair you guys off in a few weeks, I want you all to just kind of to keep praying over the person that the Holy Spirit is going to show to be your accountability partner when that time comes. Guys, have a great time in small groups. Can't wait to hear how things go. We will see you all real soon.